Hi, I'm Joan, the author of Strike the Zither, a reimagining of the Chinese classic Three Kingdoms.
Joan He is the Chinese-American best-selling author of The Ones We're Meant to Find, Descendant of the Crane, and, most recently, Strike the Zither, which just came out last fall. Her latest book is a story about betrayal and survival, where we follow Zephyr, a warrior fighting for her kingdom that has to infiltrate the enemy lines. Hi, I'm Gemma, and welcome to the Red Carpet. We have Joan here today to talk about her new book, Strike the Zither, and I'm so excited to share this book with you all. Hi, Joan. I'm so happy to have you here with us.
Hi, Gemma. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Your book is inspired by classic Chinese literature, a retelling of the Three Kingdoms, and I'm eager to hear more about Zephyr and her journey. Can you start off by telling us more about your story?
Yeah, for sure. So like you mentioned, it's a reimagining of the Chinese classic Three Kingdoms, and we're following Zephyr, who is based off of one of the greatest strategists in Chinese history, Zhuge Liang. And Zephyr, she is serving the most underdog of the three warlordesses who are fighting to control the empire, which is currently under the rule of a puppet empress. And this puppet empress is under the control of one of the big bad warlordesses. So yeah, there's a lot of betrayal and lots of sides who are all fighting for their own agendas. And there's also perhaps some big bads who are outside of the realm of humanity. They're also at work against Zephyr.
Oh, it was such an exciting book for me to read as well. The first thing that stuck out to me while reading this book was how many strong women were in charge and played important roles. Can you tell me more about these women and how you incorporated feminism into your literature?
For sure, yeah. I thought, so when I was reading the original Three Kingdoms, it definitely struck me that there were very few female characters in the classic, which makes a lot of sense because it was written during like the 1300s and during that time. And it was telling a story that was set even earlier. It's the Three Kingdoms is set during the historical period of the Han Dynasty, like at the end of the Han Dynasty. So that's around like 200 AD. And so there are very few female characters who have agency. And then when some of the characters who do have agency, they kind of end up having either terrible fates or they just fade off the page into black after their time in the spotlight is done. And so I definitely, in wanting to adapt this for a young adult book and being inspired by the young adults that I read growing up, such as like the Hunger Games, I was like, it just makes sense that instead of like 50-year-old men, we would have teenage girls. And I mean, not all the characters are teenagers, right? Because like Zephyr serves, like the warlordesses are in their early 20s, but Zephyr herself, she is based on this character, Zhuge Liang, who is so cocky and he's not cocky in the original, but he's definitely very sure of himself. He's almost deified. And I thought that would just be so fun to like make into a teenage girl character who is cocky and arrogant.
Oh, absolutely. I was so happy to see that these were women in power and they were all in charge and we didn't even have to question it. So our main character, Zephyr, plays a traitor in order to save her kingdom. For those who are not familiar with Three Kingdoms, can you tell us about her inspiration and what you put into creating her?
Yes, so her inspiration is Zhuge Liang, the historical strategist figure. And I feel like he's not well known enough in the West. I think a lot of people know about Sun Tzu and like the art of war, but Zhuge Liang is just as amazing. And so that's the base inspiration for Zephyr. And then there's a lot more, I guess, like metatextual inspiration because, like I said, Zhuge Liang, this character, he is able to pull off amazing feats in the story that almost propel it to a fantastical sort of level because he's able to do things like summon mist and change like the direction of the wind, and you're just supposed to accept this as, oh well, he's able to do this because he's so good at being a strategist. And I'm like, how is this related to his level of mastery of war if he's able to just summon wind? So that was a question I had while reading the original that I really wanted to weave into Zephyr's character. I wanted there to be an explanation that I could come up for that. And I love that you mentioned that Zephyr, she starts off the book being viewed as a traitor because she has to infiltrate the other camp, and she can't tell anyone about that to make it believing. So her original camp basically thinks that she's turned sides and she's gone to serve the stronger camp that is essentially winning the war. And I just, in general, I love writing misunderstood characters. The thing is, Zhuge Liang in the original, he never does that. He's always been like very loyal. When he manages like convince people to side with his camp, it's always just by telling them, oh, you should side with us because my lord, even though he is down on his luck, he's still like the best choice. And then he just like kill everyone with his tongue. Like he would just say all these things and everyone would just magically side with him. And I wanted to make it a little bit harder. I wanted Zephyr to be, I guess, a bit more misunderstood. And I wanted there to be a more believable reason as to why she would, for example, in the story, get to journey down to the south and talk to these other warlordesses who she might not have been able to otherwise had she stayed in her original camp.
Oh, absolutely. I have to say, when I was reading about all the times that she was being called traitor and how she was turning her back on her side, like I really felt that the emotion of her being down and just the hopelessness of it all. So I thought you did a really great job at that.
Thank you.
Romance isn't a large part of this book, but we do have a character called Crow, who you wrote as her match. Can you explain their relationship a bit more?
Yeah, so I think most simply you could call them rivals. And I really wanted to make Crow a true match for Zephyr, even though I'd say you spend a lot of the time in the book, because it is from Zephyr's point of view, right? It's her first person point of view. You spend a lot of the time in the book where she's kind of just like, dissing Crow and being like, oh, well, he's like smart, but I'm still the best, right? But I definitely wanted by the end of the book for you to see maybe that's not necessarily the case. Like Crow definitely is someone who can hold his own weight against Zephyr. And he is actually also inspired by a strategist from the original Three Kingdoms. I used to parrot around this name a lot. I'd be like, oh, Crow was inspired by blank. But then I realized that for people who actually have read the classic Three Kingdoms, when I say this name, you can actually guess one of the twists about Crow and who he serves. So I'm not going to say the name. I think once you get to the end of the book and you read like the author's note where I tell you who the original characters are and who they've then inspired, you'll see. But essentially the strategist who he's based off of, he is like known as the rival to Zhuge Liang. And there's so many iconic lines that they speak to each other that I just felt like, even though this is like a classic novel about like men and old people, right? I shouldn't say old people. I feel like some characters in there are like my age. Back when I was writing it as a teenager, I thought it was old, like 20 was old, but now I'm there. So, but there are so many lines that really felt just like YA rivals to me, where it's like, oh, I can't exist in this world if you exist in it. Like stuff like that. I was like, I need to YA-fy it and write Crow and Zephyr.
I think another thing that really stood out to me about Crow was how, like, even though he was her equal, he was still not like an alpha, in which I mean, like, he was also a little bit sickly. He wasn't like the perfect male character. And I really appreciated that you played with these balances in order to, even though they are strong characters, he also has a weakness.
For sure. I love playing with his like weakness, and especially his physical weakness, because I think both he and Zephyr are, I guess, the stereotypical Chinese scholar strategist type, where they're physically, you know, like panting for breath as they're like journeying across the realm. And so I wanted Crow to be her match too, not just in wits, but also in that sort of physicality element, right? Where she's like coughing because she basically has like ancient asthma, and Crow is like consumptive. So
yeah. So I wanted to ask, why did you choose to do a retelling of the Three Kingdoms? What liberties did you take, other than gender swapping? And what else did you remain loyal to?
I love that question because I feel like I get asked this a lot, especially because I did adapt it to young adult, where I think people enter the Three Kingdoms, especially, I mean, if you've read the original work, it's like 200,000 words long. It's like a very, it's 800, I just brain farted. It's 800,000 words long, and it's over 2,000 pages when you add all the books together. So it's very long, it's very dense, there are thousands of named characters. So you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, this would be a great young adult book, right? Like I think you would more naturally think it would be an adult adaptation. But I was really inspired to make it YA and to have this idea because one, like I mentioned, I had all these questions about Zhuge Liang as I was reading it, about how him and so many other characters from the books have basically been immortalized in Chinese culture in the sense that you can say these names, Zhuge Liang, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and automatically for someone in the culture, you can conjure these characteristics where you're like, oh yeah, Liu Bei, he's the honorable one, or Guan Yi, he's like the loyal sworn brother. And so these names are so vernacularized that I was just like, and Guan Yi himself is actually, he is actually deified in the original book. So I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to do something with that and play with that in the twist. But beyond that, initially when I was reading the book, it struck me that so many characters were archetypes of themselves and they don't really stray too far out of those archetypes. Like you're introduced to Liu Bei, the warlord, as this honorable person, and he basically remains that through most of the book, through all the book, basically. And same for the warriors, same for the strategists. I feel like the characters stayed very true to themselves in a way that I think modern literature would probably slam as like lack of growth, but that was one of the charms of the classic. And it reminded me of like teenagers sitting in the cafeteria, like sorting themselves, right, into jocks and geeks. Like when you have interactions between Zhuge Liang, the strategist, and Liu Bei's sworn brother, Guan Yu, who's like the warrior, those are just so fun. And you could really see like the author playing out the mental prowess versus the physical one. So I thought it'd be really fun to explore that in a young adult book.
So I also have to mention the accessibility of this series as well. Your book is, what, 300 pages long? It's very accessible to people who are not in the Chinese culture. When I originally looked up the book that you suggested, it was very intimidating. I looked at it and then I put it down because I didn't know where to start with it. But yours is much more easily digestible. It still has the heart of the nature of the books, but far less intimidating to read. So I have to thank you because I never would have looked up the Three Kingdoms myself because 2,000 pages is a lot to read versus, a few hundred pages that it's just as enjoyable. So thank you for that.
I'm really glad that you enjoyed the accessibility of Strike the Zither because I feel like that was one of my big goals in writing it, which is that it's not meant to be a textbook for Three Kingdoms, but it's something to get you, I guess, appetized and interested to look up the source after reading Strike. And that almost made me remember that I almost forgot to answer the second part of your question, which is what has really stayed and what has changed from the classic to Strike the Zither. And obviously, like the length and like the amount of characters has changed.
On the topic of names, Zephyr is not actually her real name. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, so Zephyr is a sobriquet for the character whose birth name is Pan Qilin. And that is a big element in the original Three Kingdoms, which is that, and not just Three Kingdoms, all throughout Chinese history, starting from the Qing dynasty, not the Qing dynasty that ends with G. I feel like I can never pronounce like the N and the NG separation, but the QIN dynasty, the very early one, even before the Han Dynasty. Starting from there, there's this tradition in China where, especially among the educated class, you wouldn't address someone who was your equal by their birth name, and you definitely wouldn't do that for someone who was above you in rank, right? You wouldn't go around calling people by their birth names because it was very rude and it just showed that you were uncultured. Instead, when you came of age, you would gain a sobriquet or a courtesy name, or sometimes they're called style names. In Chinese, it's a zi. And so your zi is this name that you gain that is sometimes descriptive of your character, but other times it's just like, for very, I guess, esoteric Chinese reasons, sometimes it just wouldn't be descriptive at all. It'd just be characters that sound good together. Like I wouldn't go out there and be giving out these names to people because they would come from someone who was educated, right? Like it would be gifted to you. So.
Oh, thank you so much for that insight because that was something that I didn't actually pick up on until later on in the book. So getting to hear it from you is very exciting. Strike the Zither is your first duology. How is this different from your previous books?
Well, definitely the duology aspect has made it very different. Even though, funnily enough, when I first conceived of Strike the Zither and I started writing it, I did envision it as one big giant chunk tome, like one epic standalone. probably something that would end up in the range of 700 to 800 pages. And I ended up splitting it, both because it seemed more pragmatic. It's much easier to, convince your publisher to publish a 300-page book than something that's 800 pages. And also because it just felt more fitting for Zephyr's journey the more I kept on writing it. Like when I got to what I originally thought was going to be the 25% mark of this giant book, and is now the 50% mark, I just felt like so much had happened that by the end of book one, I felt like Zephyr herself needed sort of like a break or a time lapse where you as the reader can kind of sit with everything that she's gone through before going into the second volume.
On your website, you wrote, "Reading is an interactive experience." Can you talk more about this?
Yes, I wrote that because I was getting a lot of questions about the ending of my second book, The Ones We're Meant to Find, because it does end on a more open ending. And it was really fascinating to me because when I was writing the book and reading it, I didn't feel like the ending was that open because I had interpreted events and characters and their choices obviously through my brain, right? And so I was like, well, I could, even though the ending isn't written in black and white, like as to what happens, I could like intuit what would happen if there were another page. But then it was really interesting to me to see how readers had all different sorts of reactions. Like I've seen people arrive at the ending that I thought was in my brain. I've seen people arrive at different endings. I've seen like family members who arrive at endings I never even imagined. I was like, how did you get that, right? But that's what was so fascinating to me because I was like, everyone experiences the book differently, and everyone is going to relate to characters differently. Like even though the words are the same, you can read a character and understand them perhaps even more deeply than me because you are bringing your own emotional experience into the story. And so definitely, I'm glad that I didn't like seal up the ending in like a neat bow because I think it's so telling of what the story has meant to you, and what you've taken away from it based on what ending you kind of conjure in your head, having gone on this adventure with the characters.
Oh, absolutely. And my interpretation of Zither is going to be different than your interpretation of how you even wrote it as well. So even so, I'm still excited to get to go on this journey with her. So not to spoil anything, but Strike the Zither has a pretty big plot twist. I pretty much lost my mind when I got to this point. What was your process when coming up with something like this?
I am so glad you enjoyed the twist. It makes my heart very happy. I think it's the thing where every new book I send out into the world, I'm like, I hope I make someone's face melt in the best way possible. As to how I construct my twist, the process is pretty similar from Strike and to my second and my first book, in that I start with the premise. So I think of the premise, for example, Strike the Zither is about a strategist who thinks she's the best, and has to try to help her warlords. And I think just based on this premise, I ask myself, how do I subvert it? With this limited amount of information, is there something that I can flip in a big way? And I always like to go back, because I kind of already touched on how I came up with the twist for Strike, where I was like inspired by the character Zephyr is based off of and how he has been remembered in Chinese culture. But in general, I like to give this example from like Titanic, where even though Titanic is like historical, right? Like we know what happened. If it were a story, the premise would be the unsinkable ship is going to cross the Atlantic. So just based on that, right? How do you flip it in a way that's really big? Like maybe it's not crossing Atlantic. Maybe the ocean turns out to be in space. Maybe it's not a ship. Maybe it's not unsinkable. So based on those very limited elements, what's the thing that you can flip? And based on that, I usually have that big subversion or flip occurring at the 50% mark. And I try to like to figure that out first. After having the premise, of course, I like to figure out what the 50% mark event is going to be. Like, what is this expectation that I have led you to believe from 0 to 50% I'm now going to flip on its head? And of course, I don't want it to feel random. Like, even if it's very big, I want it to somehow tie into how the characters understand themselves, the world. I want it to somehow further the story too. So once I have the 50% mark, I kind of build out from it like a tent pole. I figure out the pieces that I need to have from the beginning that lead up to it, and I figure out what the fallout is going to be after you get to this big event. I really love stories where when you get to the 50% mark, you're like, how is there so much story left, right? It's like all this big stuff has happened. And I just love that feeling of like a book that is confident, that has more to show you after it reveals what seems to be its biggest card at the time.
Oh, thank you so much for that, because I was always wondering, like, it's not a Joan book if it doesn't blow your mind. So I'm always so excited whenever I get to those points in the book. So getting to hear about how you came up with that, like, is so much more insight than I thought. Thank you. Since the book came out, what has the response been like so far?
It's been I've honestly been so happy with how like readers have found the book and received it. This book, I actually envisioned it coming out after Descendant. I'd written Strike during that period where my debut Descendant of the Crane was on submission, and I wasn't sure at the time if it was going to sell, but I was telling myself, well, if it is going to sell, I would love to follow up with another Chinese fantasy, even if it's very different. So it's been a long time coming because it had to wait its turn to come out. So I'm just really grateful. And it's been really interesting too, seeing like the different responses. I think in general, like there's always a tricky line to walk for authors where you want to see how it's being received, but you also don't want to see too much. But I've been really happy with how people have found it. And especially like I've seen a lot of people who are like, I know nothing about the Three Kingdoms and I really enjoyed the book, and those readers make me really happy. And I've also seen a few readers who are like, I love the Three Kingdoms, and I could trace like who everyone was. I was like, yes, like I love you because you are like me. Like I want, even if there are not that many out there, like I want it to find readers too who are like me, because at the end of the day, I feel like I write all my books first for myself. I want to be entertained by them, so I want to honor the readers who do know everything about Three Kingdoms and still surprise them even if they know the plot events.
Oh, that's so lovely. And I clearly am a huge fan of all of this. You began your writing journey pretty young and have had your whole experience shared on your website. Can you tell us what difficulties you encounter while writing and publishing?
Yeah, now thinking back, it's really been quite some time. I feel like years pass faster and faster, but I think like the biggest struggle in the beginning was it's just like with any sort of art-based career, a lot of it is so subjective. And so the early years really are spent, at least for me, I was trying to improve my craft. I was trying to get better with every book that I wrote. But at a certain point, right, you level up, and then it really is, are you going to get the right yes at the right time? So I wrote like I wrote 3 books before my 4th, which would end up being Descendant of the Crane. And I just remember when I was querying those books and trying to find an agent, those were probably some of the hardest times of the entire writing career. Even now when I'm like, oh, like it's so hard, I just feel like it doesn't quite compare to back then, because back then it's like you just don't know if anyone is going to want to take you on. You don't know if you get an agent, if your book is going to sell. So that was very hard. And also what was very hard was, I mean, I started writing seriously probably in like 2012, 2013. And this was before like the We Need Diverse Books movement. So my first 3 books, I mean, the main characters, I didn't really describe their race, but they probably defaulted to white. And like the stories themselves were not really tied to like my culture or my heritage or any of those things, because I just didn't see stories like that on the shelves. And I was obviously writing things that I was inspired by. Like, for example, my first book, like I said, I read like, maybe I haven't mentioned this yet, but I read a ton of like dystopians when I was a teenager. So my first book was, of course, a young adult dystopian. It was like one of those. And so because I was writing what I was inspired by, it didn't really occur to me that I could publish something, right, that was Chinese-based or Chinese fantasy until Descendant of the Crane, when it was on submission. In the first version, it was a half Chinese, half Rome world, because I thought I needed to dilute down the Chinese elements to make it more palatable. And it wasn't really until I got rejected completely on submission the first round that I was like, you know what, like, it seems like some of the feedback was the world feels like it doesn't go deep enough. And I was like, you know what, that's right, because I'm holding myself back. I'm trying to like make things more palatable. Why not just make it fully Chinese? So I spent like a year rewriting that book, and making it a fully Chinese world where the world and the plot and just everything is influenced by the culture and also by a lot of the C-dramas that I watched growing up. And I think there's a reason why my first 3 books, I did not revise them really. I did not really stick with them. And Descendant, I did. I worked on that book for 3 years before it sold. And it's because I kept on feeling pulled back to it. I kept on telling myself, if I don't write this book, like, I feel like there's no one else who can write it exactly the way I want it to be written. And since then, I feel like now that's the litmus test that all my books need to pass for me, because I know exactly how hard the process is. I know how much rejection there is. And I know that even when you do publish a book, there's no guarantee that's going to find its readers. So it has to be something that I feel like I need to write. Otherwise, I don't think I could see it existing. I don't think I could relate to it in a way that I would want to relate to it.
And as you mentioned, you were inspired by dystopian books, and so your first book was dystopian, but I hope that someday someone's going to look back and think maybe this could be an inspiration to them as well, and also think that writing about their own culture is okay. So, pioneers.
Well, of course, there are also, I feel like I have to say, there are authors before me too. Like, I think Cindy Pon, like, I remember seeing her book like on the shelves when I was in like middle school. I was like, oh my God, there's like a Chinese girl like on this cover, right? I feel like there have always been people who are pushing. It's just that the conditions are more favorable or less favorable depending on the times, right? So like, I always get when people say like, oh my God, you're the first Chinese fantasy. I was like, oh my God, that's not true. But it just so happened that I was at that time where you did start seeing more of a push for, like diverse voices, and you see more bookstore placements, things like that increase the visibility.
Yeah, representation is so important, and now that we have more Asian fantasy authors out there, like I'm glad to be able to add yours to the list as well. So what are you most excited for readers to experience in this book?
I mean, you already said, like, I'm excited for them to experience the twist, right? Really excited also for the epilogue. I love epilogues. And I especially enjoy trying to make this one like as evil of a cliffhanger as possible, because I want you to pick up my second book when it eventually comes out.
Okay, so we are a K-pop station. Can you give us a recommendation from something that you listen to?
So I admittedly, don't kill me, I do not listen to that much K-pop, so I'm not like up to date. But like the K-pop I have encountered are mainly from like K-dramas. I loved Moon Lovers, and I love that OST. So my favorite song from that was I think it's called I Can Hear Your Heart. It's by Lee Hi and Epic High.
All right, I'm going to have to give that a shot. Check it out.
It's so good. You should watch the drama and be destroyed by that, and then also listen to the OST.
Okay, will do. Your new book, Strike the Zither, was recently released last fall. Can you tease the audience with something from the book?
All right, something to tease y'all. I have to say, I'm gonna just read the first line because it's one of my favorite first liners, and it just tells you exactly who Zephyr is. Some say the heavens dictate the rise and fall of empires. Clearly, those peasants have never met me.
An excellent first line. So, Sound the Gong, which is the sequel, has been announced. Can you tell us anything about it?
Well, it's called Sound the Gong. I was really excited to reveal the title because Strike the Zither, the title, it faced a few hills, and that definitely, like, people were like, what is a zither? What is striking? So Sound the Gong, I'm very happy to announce it, is a more, I guess, commonly like understood, has words that are more commonly understood. And as to what I can reveal about it, I don't want to give away too much. I mean, the copy summary of the book is up on retailers. If you want to like Google Sound the Gong, you can find that. But other than that, I mean, everything bad that you think Zephyr did in Strike the Zither, she is way worse in Sound the Gong. And if you get to the end of Strike the Zither, you know that even though Zephyr has overcome a lot of things, there are some failures that come to face her at the end. And we all know, I mean, if you've read the book, you know how Zephyr deals with failure. You know how she feels being bested. So I would be very worried for whoever it is that she thinks she now needs to best again, because she has to have the last word, right? That's the thing about Zephyr. She can't end on a loss. So be worried, but also be excited because I mean, I feel like I got so many comments on Strike the Zither about wanting more Zephyr and Crow, and I totally get it because I love writing the parts where they're together, but unfortunately via like circumstances and the necessity of kingdom building, Zephyr and Crow cannot be together for like half the book. But that's not the case in Sound of God. I mean, they are together for a lot. I can't say you'll like the times that they're together, or that Crow likes them, but there definitely is more Zephyr and Crow, so I would say look forward to that.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Yeah, for sure. Like, I'm going to be reaching out for an arc soon. Okay, so where can we find your books for purchase?
You can find them on all the major retailers, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. I would recommend shopping indie if you can. And if you go to my Instagram, there's a post where I have a list of indie bookstores who have the book and also have the art card that is behind me and also behind Gemma. Yes, you can still get that art card if you order from the indie bookstores.
And there's a spoiler on the back that we won't be showing, but it's very exciting. It's one of the highlights of the book.
Yes.
And thank you so much for mentioning about indie bookstores. We also want to support them as well. But also, where can we find you on social media?
I am unfortunately on all the social media platforms, even though to a lesser extent these days on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok under the same handle at all three, which is Joan He Writes. But I'm mostly on Instagram, mostly there.
Thank you so much for all of these insights on your book, Joan. I absolutely cannot wait for Sound the Gong to release. In the meantime, I'm sure our audience will enjoy being swept away following Zephyr in her battle to find her place in this world.
Thank you, Gemma. This was so much fun. I'm so happy I got to talk to you. I mean, I've seen your posts about Strike for the longest time, and it makes me so happy, grateful.
Thank you so much. My guest today has been author Joan He with her book, Strike the Zither, available for purchase wherever books are sold. You can find us with more conversations with authors at 24hourkpop.com. I'm Gemma for the Kpop-TV Entertainment Network, and I'll see you next time.